Hello everybody, welcome on how to disassemble your Honda horizontal engine, and this will apply to 50, 70 and 90cc variants that have a 12 volt electric system, although as a little caveat, this is actually a 6 volt motor. They didn't make very many 6 volt CDI bikes. This is from either an 82 or an 83. That's the transition year they made from 6 to 12 volt. So if there are some very small minor detail differences as I'm disassembling this and you say, well, my engine doesn't quite look like that, keep in mind this is a very early version of the quote 12 volt engines where they switch from points to CDI. The disassembly process exactly the same. This also covers many pit bike engines, again 50, 70 and 90cc. The main thing is that this engine that you're going to be working on has a primary clutch, which looks like this, and not a secondary clutch, which looks like this. So, before we begin, I'm going to show you a few tools that you're going to absolutely need. So the first tool you're going to need is an impact screwdriver. This is not really optional because the screws that hold in your clutch are very, very tight, and if you try using a regular screwdriver, you're probably going to strip them out. So you're going to need an impact screwdriver. Get a couple of bits as well, because sometimes those break. You're also going to need a screwdriver. It's the number 2 crosshead. I actually recommend getting 2 of these. I find that having 2 screwdrivers just makes things go by much smoother. Some engines have hex head or Allen head bolts. Really depends. I can't tell you which engine does and doesn't have that, so it's always a good idea to have these on the side. This is another required tool. This is a Castle nut driver, and this is required for, or very, very highly recommended for removing the nut that holds your clutch to the crankshaft. Also, if it is a double-sided socket like this, you will need to have an extension. Another required tool, I will say highly recommended because you can sort of get away in a pinch without it, is a strap wrench. Now this is a chain wrench, yes I know. This is for removing oil filters off of vehicles and holding whichever steady. But it is highly, highly recommended to get this so that you can, especially, I've already removed this knot, okay, so you can see that. But when you are removing the flywheel, you strap the chain around the flywheel, and or the strap. You lock the flywheel, and then you use your socket. In this case, a 40mm bolt, and you have to, and then you crack the bolt off. If you use an impact driver, you can actually knock the crank out of balance. Now, if you're rebuilding the crankshaft, no big deal. But if you are just replacing the magneto or something, or just checking, whatever it is that whatever it is you're doing, say a timing chain or something, you can knock the crank out of balance, so be aware of that. So a strap wrench, chain wrench, whichever, as long as you can lock whatever it is you're holding. Of course, if you use a chain, make sure to put padding underneath the chain so that it doesn't damage the housing of your clutch basket or your flywheel. Next tool I recommend, not recommend, it's required, are snap ring pliers. These are what you would use to remove snap rings, hey surprise, and so you will need those. I actually have 2 sets that I use. I like this one quite a bit. Sometimes when you are, it's just, you can see it's not angled downward like these are. I just like to have extra tools on the side, so it's just completely up to you as long as you have a set of snap ring pliers. There are a few snap rings you need to take off. Next is are spanners. It's not just a 10mm spanner. You can see this one is the USA standard. In Chinese, that means crap. Also, this is if you're adjusting your valves, it's to have a curved spanner. It's not 100% necessary, but I find it nice. This is, it's a curved ring spanner. This one, the side is a 9mm and the other side is an 8mm. The reason for that is because when you are accessing the valve cover, you can see that the knot's going to be down there inside. So if you want to rotate around that knot, you're going to find this very helpful. It's not necessary though. And the last thing, the last set of tools that I really like to have is this. There's an L-shaped socket wrench, and it's a 1/4 inch drive. And I get two types of sockets. I get two 8mm ones, and then you have a 10mm socket. The 10mm bolts and 8mm bolts are super common on these things. So if you have this L-shaped socket driver, whichever you want to call it, it speeds things up very well. I don't like ratchets myself. I find these are a lot faster. So I highly recommend getting this. And one more required tool that you are going to need is the flywheel puller. Many different bikes, even if they are Cubs, 50, 70 and 90, they have different types of flywheels and different types of, and they're going to require a different puller. I can't tell you which one is which, so you're just going to have to look that up yourself, but do note that you will need a flywheel puller, because the flywheel itself is completely seized onto the crankshaft because there is a taper. Okay, so that is a tool that you cannot use a hammer. You will damage the flywheel, especially if you have a cast flywheel, and it's not pretty. You will ride around and it will explode. I'm not joking. I wish I was, but so I've not actually done that before, but I do know people who have. Okay, so you need a flywheel puller. You have to buy this. No ifs, ands, or buts. And that's it for the tools that are required. I do recommend also getting a gasket scraper if you're not good at clearing gasket off of surfaces. When it comes to Workspace, what I like to do is have a table at least this big. I also like to have another table that you can put larger parts on. It could just be a small set of shelves, it could be something, as long as you can put your parts in what I call a chronological order. So if whatever part you take off first, you put it in one space, and then you take off next part and put it in another space. It's like reading a book. So when you see that your parts are in order, it makes it much easier to put together. How I like to set up my workbench is I have a main workbench where the engine sits on. I have a bucket, such as this. It's about 20 centimeters, 25 centimeters roundabout. That way I can set the engine horizontally on it, so I can work on one side or the other instead of having the engine stand straight up like this. And also, for organizational purposes, I like to have a small desk or a table like this, and whatever I'm working on, I'll get these little baking tins, and I can put the hardware in these. I like the baking tins because not only are they recyclable, but if they're metal, you can dump solvents, like carburetor cleaner and paint stripper and all of that fun stuff on some parts that you want to clean, and they won't melt through the container. Also, if you have sturdy, these are not very sturdy, but if you get like higher, thicker versions, you can secure them with their lids and use the lid to, and then you can store the parts and you won't knock them over and then hardware goes flying everywhere. This is completely optional. What I like to do is have two small cups or containers, vertical containers like that. One of them I put the clutch bolts in, all of them, so the bolts that hold on the clutch cover, like these. And then I have another one for the bolts that hold on the crank case together, and that keeps those, because there's it was what, 8 or 9, I'm not sure. That keeps them very organized as well. So you can just say, okay, time to put the clutch on, and then you just pull the bolts out from one side and try them in, and it works at saving you a bit of time that way. And these are for the crankcase bolts, because there are many different sizes. So that's what I like to do with that. And as I've said with the baking tins, I like to use them in order as well. So say I'm taking one thing apart, I put, let's say we're taking the head bolts and studs off. Anything related to the cylinder head will go into here. And then the next stage I will put bolts and such into here. And next stage go into here. So like I said, you can read it like a book, or if you read backwards, as I say, you can go that way, whichever. Also use the small cardboard boxes like this. It helps keeping things dirty. It absorbs oil off of parts very, very well, and also so they're recyclable, so it's a cheap and easy way to keep things going very smoothly with the disassembly of your engine. Okay, two things before we begin disassembling our engine. The first thing I highly recommend is that you do not order any parts before you start disassembling your engine, and there are two reasons why. The first is that as you take apart your engine, there might be things that are broken inside or highly worn out that you are not aware of, and you will need to order those on top of ordering any parts such as gaskets and whatnot. So there's no reason to start ordering things before you completely inspect the inside of your engine. And the second reason is because some engines, well, due to the nature of how easy it is to work on these engines, it's completely possible that some of the parts and some of the equipment on your engine has been retrofitted on. So if you go by the simple the number of your bike, it might not get you the correct replacement part anyway. So it's very, very important that you see what part is in your hand so that you know exactly which to order, so that you know what is going to work. The first thing to note, yes, there are things that have been taken off of this engine, such as this cover. Okay, so I've already removed this cover. There's no special technique to it. It's just 3 bolts, literally 3 bolts. Sometimes you have a two-piece cover where you have this side and then this chain guard side is separate. It just really depends on which bike that you have. I have also removed this right here. Okay, all that is a black plug, and there's no special way to remove it. You just stick a screwdriver in there or some small blade, and then you just pop it off. That's it. So it's a black plug. I had taken it out, and then I realized I could do a disassembly video on this engine, so that's why some of the parts are already removed. I apologize for that. Also, this nut has been removed. I will tell you how to remove that nut, but I'm just telling you that yes, it is not there, obviously. And also, if you notice that there's some of the parts look brand new, as I said, I actually started disassembling this engine before I started shooting video, and then I realized I could do a video on it, and so as I said, some parts might look new. There's one last thing, one last little caveat. This engine is actually running a big bore cylinder. Before you remove the engine from the frame, there are a few things I recommend doing beforehand. The first, I recommend loosening your valve covers. This is sometimes these are really baked on there, and so they can be a bit hard to crack because this engine is about 18 kilograms, and so it's not very heavy. So when you try and torque those valve covers off, it could be sometimes the engine squirms. Of course, it's not the end of the world. It's not going to be impossible, but I just like to loosen the valve covers in the first place, like this. So obviously you need a spanner. I've pre-loosened these. So it's really easy. Engine's on the bike, and then you go crack with the spanner, crack, and then they come off easily. Also, when it comes to the clutch side, by the way, of course I've removed the dipstick already. I do recommend actually working and removing the clutch cover and the related hardware before you remove it from the bike. The reason I recommend this is because there's a bit of oil that comes out and can be a bit messy. So it's much easier if you have your engine in the bike and you place a little receiver tray underneath it, take the cover off, knock the cover off, and it drains into the tray. But if you have it on a workbench like this, when you remove the cover, you're going to have a lot of oil spill out all over into your bench. I also recommend, if possible, I mean it's not completely necessary, but I recommend when we work on the clutch, I recommend also leaving it on the bike for that work. Because the clutch is full of oil and it drips out, and also you will need to be using your impact screwdriver to bang on it. So when you have the bike there, it actually has a bit of a weight. Again, it's not necessary, it's just something I find that works a bit easier. and after that you can pretty much everything, you're clear to take the engine off of the bike. Also, if you happen to be kind of weak, when you remove extra weight such as the clutch and the cover, it's easier to pick up off the to remove the engine and slide it out. So first, what we are going to do is remove the clutch cover. As I've said, I recommend keeping the engine in the bike because you can keep it holds the engine above ground, obviously, and you can put an oil receiver tray underneath it. So when you pop the clutch cover off, it's going to drain all that extra oil into the into your tray. So first, we're going to do is we're going to remove the 8mm bolts around here. And sometimes, if you have a this actual one actually used to have screws. A couple of the old bikes have screws, so you will need your impact screwdriver for that one. But these are 8mm bolts. Nothing special about those. Okay, here is the hardware removed from the clutch cover side. You can see it's 5 small bolts, 2 long ones and 1 really long one. By the way, that's the one that I had already removed, and so yeah, just so you know what it looks like. What I like to do is to keep it all separate and organized, so I know that it's from this side of the engine and nothing else. I like to grab all the hardware and stuff it in a container like so. That way I don't cross up any of the bolts with the side of the case. You know, this makes things a bit easier. Also, at this time, if you want to, you can dump some solvents in there, or petrol or something, swish it around in there, put a lid on it, and it will soak the grime up, and then you can wash off the hardware later. But for now, let's just put this in our, because that is our first step, we'll put it in there. And next, if this engine is still on your bike, what as I've said, is put the oil tray underneath it. If your gasket hasn't really been, or if your engine hasn't really been used that much, as you're undoing the bolts, the cover might already start to come off. However, if you have a engine where it hasn't been taken off any time recently, the cover might be a bit stubborn. And so what I like to do is, and so what you have to understand in removing the cover is that there are 3 basic places where it can bind. Bind meaning it's holding it in there quite firmly. The first place is over here, and that is because when I say over here, I mean inside here, and that's because there's a dowel pin that is used to locate the cover. And so there's a little dowel pin, collar, whatever you want to call it there. There's another one here, right there. So there's one there, and then the last place, of course, is the gasket itself. And so if you have loosened all the bolts and the engine is not coming off, or the cover is not coming off of the engine, and what you can do is, or this is what I like to do, it's my personal method, of course your methods may vary, but I crack this nut loose. Okay, it's a 14mm knot. I'll crack it loose. I start to undo the adjuster with a flathead screwdriver, like so, and you do it anti-clockwise. Okay, so I turn the adjuster anti-clockwise, and the reason I do this, and you're going to feel a bit of resistance, okay, so that is completely normal. I keep tightening it down. The reason I do this is because this adjuster is meant to push against the clutch pack and taking up the slack, so that your semi-automatic clutch can be properly adjusted all of the time. But what you do is, if you do the adjuster too tightly, what that does is it pushes further and further onto the clutch pack, and what that does is it creates pressure. So it's as if you have a little helper in here who is pushing, trying to push the clutch cover outwards. So it helps you in cracking the clutch cover loose. So I give it a few turns if it's a little bit difficult. If the cover, in this case, you can see the bolts are all on there, but it is not coming off, I tighten the adjuster first. Okay, then what I like to do is if you haven't removed the dipstick, I'll do that first. I use this as a sort of leverage point. Okay, so I'll stick my finger in here and I'll start to pull, and obviously I can't do it because I'm holding the camera. But then I take a sort of mallet and I start a rubber mallet. Don't use a metal one on this. It's an aluminium cover. It's very, very fragile. So I start pulling on this side, and then I start hitting it with my hand or something soft like a rubber mallet to try and crack it loose. And the reason you want to pull on this side as well is because the Kickstarter is actually putting a little bit of pressure on the cover to remain in there. It's putting pressure this way. I will pull this side, give it a few whacks on this side, and when the gasket starts to crack, you will notice small streams of oil coming out of the engine. When you do that, when you see that, you're getting close. Okay, you can see that with a little bit of encouragement, this has actually separated already. But you can see that it's a little bit, it's crooked though. And that's going to make removing the cover difficult. So I'm going to take the adjuster and I'm going to turn it clockwise, so that the cover is I'm going to remove the tension because we have already cracked the gasket. And then what I'm going to do, see, there you go, is now the dowel has worked its way loose from here. And so now that, since it's already cracked off, all you need to do is wiggle back and forth to remove the cover. And whatever you do, don't take something like this and jam it down in there and try and pry it loose, because you will damage the surface. And it's not a good way to do things. Do not do that. If, however, your gasket is very, very caked on and it is just not budging at all, what you can do though is you can take a razor blade, put the razor blade exactly on the edge of the gasket like this, so it will slide in between both sides, blade side down, and tap it in with a mallet or something. And what that will do is that will shove the razor blade between, it will actually cut the gasket and it will break the seal. And so if it comes down to that, you can do that, but do not use any kind of bladed instrument like this to pry it loose, because you will scratch the surface, you will damage the surface, and it's not recommended at all. So let us commence with removing the clutch cover. I'm going to bang it loose now. Okay, if your cover looks like this, you're probably going to have a lot of oil spilling out of the of here, and so that's why I recommend, of course, putting the bowl underneath there. But at this point, now you heard that thunk, right? That means that the clutch hardware, the semi-automatic adjuster and hardware inside of there has fallen off. Okay, beware that it's possible that there's a few bits in here that can fall off of the clutch into your bowl of oil. So when we take it, when I'm going to take it off now, I'm going to show you what has fallen off. And what has fallen off is the triangle little roller, which is what goes here, and your spring. You see that? So these two things can fall. Actually, they fall off every time. And so now these usually stay where they are, but these also can fall off also. So I'm going to walk through what hardware this is. This is, so you have your little shifter arm, okay, and then you have this which goes up against your bearing, and usually the bearing doesn't fall out when you remove the clutch cover. In fact, I don't think it ever does. And also inside of this, on top of the clutch, it's that I can't get it out with one hand. Look, let me bang it. There you go. You have your collar with the spring, and you have this which mounts up to the throw-out bearing, as I call it. So you're going to have these things, and so what I'm going to do as I won't do this for every single step, but I just wanted to show you how as I said, I have sort hardware. So everything related to the clutch is going to go into this baking tin, so that way I know what step that is. So there we go. So now I know that all of that hardware is there. It's possible that the bearing falls out. I'm going to keep it in there because I'm going to knock these 4 screws loose now. And so that is the next step. What you will do, you will need an impact driver for this. Remove these 4 screws. We're going to go do that now. Okay, now chances are, oh, by the way, if these screws look like this, you are okay to go. There's nothing, you can obviously use these again, but if you have any sort of damage on the threads, or I guess the face of the screw, go ahead and order some new ones. I recommend getting extras anyway. Because, like I said, if you work on bikes a lot, you're going to go through a lot of those screws if you remove the clutch plate on and off. What I like to do is I like to replace these with Allen head screws, with the hex head screws, and so they're much easier to take off and on. But again, that's just me. I don't like impact screwdrivers. So, but chances are this is stuck on here, and so this is a up to you sort of method. This is what I actually do, is I use a flathead screwdriver and I sort of wedge it between here and I sort of turn it. And what that can do is it gives you a little bit of leverage between the cover and the clutch housing, but you can scratch it. It's easy to scratch, so I would look for trying to get between the gasket and the corner over here. Or I would look, as I said, against this edge over here between, the washer, if you have, well, actually they all have washers. So wedging between the washer and the corner over here. But if you don't want to scratch it, another possible method, what you can do, is you can bang on the corner, get a sort of dull tool or whichever, bang on the corner, mount it on the corner and bang it to where it rotates. So it will rotate the plate like that, and you can possibly crack it loose that way. Another method, of course, you can take a knife or something and a razor blade and tap it in between the gasket and the housing so that you can cut it. That is, again, as I said, it's up to you, many methods on getting it out. It's just, but again, don't do it this way though. Don't try and put a screwdriver and then use it to pry it off. That is a very, very bad way to do things, and you will scratch up the housing. So once you crack that loose, you're going to pull it off. Remember though, the bearing can fall out. Oftentimes it can, okay, this one's not going to fall out on me, but the bearing is not a press fit at all. It usually just slides in, so be aware of that. And so if you turn this over for any reason, the bearing can come out. A note on the gasket: if the gasket is not torn and you don't see big chunks of gasket around your housing like this, it's not required that you get a new one. But of course it's always good to have a new gasket on hand. I personally like to get a couple of these just because if you take apart the clutch so easily, especially if you're servicing the centrifuge, this one's already been cleaned out, as you can see, but if you are cleaning this out, you want, this is where all the accumulation of metal particles and debris comes into, so I clean that out and I pull this plate off often. That's why I like the Allen head screws, and I clean out right there. So now we are at this point. You see that we have there is going to be one tab, if this has been built right, which is locked into place in one of the tabs of the castle nut. Okay, and in this case you can see it's this one over here. So what you're going to do is, this time you can use a screwdriver, flathead screwdriver, put it in between the housing of the nut and the tab washer and pry it loose. Pry it away from the castle nut itself. Obviously what this tab is a way to lock the nut, or prevent the nut from backing out. Okay, you see, now we are clear what the next step is you grab your strap wrench for this one, and what you're going to do is lock it around the housing of the clutch. Okay, a belt wrench, belt strap wrench, or a metal band strap wrench is much more ideal. I showed you mine as a chain. I don't recommend using that without a lot of padding and a lot of maybe some old inner tubes or something from your tires, and putting on a cushion between the strap, the chain, and your clutch housing. So lock the housing in place, and what you need to do is take your castle nut driver, socket, and of course undo the knot in here. So I'm going to do that off camera. Okay, now your nut is loose, so we're going to back out the nut. Okay, now you see there's two washers in there. There's the tab washer, and then there's the Belleville washer, it's called, which is the washer that says outside. Just make sure that those don't disappear on you. So, but what you can do, well, this is how I like to pull the clutch off, because the clutch will now come off if you pull it. I just like to use my thumb to secure the washers from not falling out. You see how I put my thumb over that? And then I just start wiggling the clutch loose. And you see how easily, well, I mean, it might be a little difficult to come off, but you see what I mean is that I prevent those two washers from falling out, and I can pull the clutch pack off. Also, you want to pull the collet off, the collet, whatever, with that. So at this point, this is how I like to do what I call a hardware regrouping, I guess you could say. Is I say, hey, time for another baking tin, because or if you want, actually, you can use your original baking tin. Totally up to you how things are organized. This one's full, so I'm just going to put the miscellaneous clutch hardware, such as the 4 screws. If you are not planning on doing this all in one take, make notes of which parts you might want to replace, such as these. Inspect the collar for wear, refer to your Honda manual for it, and inspect your gear for wear too. This one I know is good. I've inspected them before. I've torn this motor apart about 10 times now. And remember your Belleville washer and your tab washer. Put those in there. Knot in there too. And I'm going to put the pressure plate and the body cover in there also. That way we are all organized. That is everything related to the clutch. Yes, there is a spacer over here, but you notice on some bikes, especially this one, the drive gear actually prevents you from removing it. So do you remember that is there? You'll probably put that in your tin afterwards. But actually I'm going to put these here, so you can put it in the tin afterwards. Now when it comes to larger things such as your clutch pack, you're obviously not going to be confused when you look at it. You're not going to be thinking, hang on a second, is this my piston? Or maybe it's the camshaft. Oh wait, no, I remember, it's the clutch. You're not going to do that. And so with large assemblies like this, what I do is I actually just set it on a counter far away. If you want, you can wrap it in a bag if you're afraid it's going to get any amount of dirt and dust on it. But as I said, like large assemblies like this, I just put it on a counter, or I just put it in a box or something, just so it's out of the way. These things, of course, there's going to be lots of oil and residue on them, so it's not a bad idea to put them over pieces of cardboard, or put them in a plastic bag so that the oil doesn't leak everywhere. Now also, when you have your clutch cover, there's a lot of oil that's going to be on the inside of this, and so it's not a bad idea to put this also in some sort of a plastic bag or a box or something, to make sure that you don't make such a mess of everything everywhere until you get the chance to clean it out appropriately, and to scrape off the old gasket material if you need to. As you can see, we do need to. The gasket has broken on this one. Also, at this point, you can remove the dowels in here also. That is, so you keep track of them or not. Of course, I'm going to clean up the clutch cover separately, but that is just a heads up. Also, if you want, you can remove this, because that is in case you are going to be painting the cover for any reason. Also, if you do plan on painting the cover, though, there's no reason to remove this seal. And the reason I say that is because this seal will actually cover the inner diameter of this area right here, and act as a sort of masking tape, masking agent. So you don't have to remove that. But if you're going to paint the cover, strip the paint off or polish it and whatnot, I would not remove that seal. So that's all the hardware related to the clutch cover. Just like the clutch pack, where it's a big thing, put it off to the side. You're not going to confuse this with other parts unless you are a monumental moron. And we are going to continue on. Okay, next what I like to actually do, well, I should have said that I'd like to do this first after removing the clutch cover, is I like to pull out the screen, okay, the oil screen, the strainer, and I like to check for metal bits and things that might have come off and have trapped itself in there. Of course, put it in your bag, your tins. Next, what we're going to do is we are going to remove this drive gear. This is the 50 drive gear, and so it might look a little bit different than yours. It's this one is a bit thin because this is you've got to remember this is a 50 engine, and what you're going to need to do is to remove the snap ring, which is right here. And so you're going to use your snap ring pliers and remove that now. Okay, so you can see the snap ring has been removed, and of course put your hardware off to the side or in a tin. This gear now will completely slide off, so all you need to do is grab it and pull, and it will slide off just like that. And here you go. You can check for play in the gear, you can check for wear and such. I recommend, this is going to be a shorter disassembly video, so I'm not going to go into the details, but yes, I'm just saying is that you can inspect this. The rivets might be slightly loose and you might have wear on the teeth, so go inspect what you need. And also at this point, because they're easy to forget, I grab the collar, now that you can slide it off, and put it with those parts of your clutch basket. Okay, now what I do is, this is going in, by the way, it's going in no particular order, okay, so I'm just going to keep doing things as we, just as we go, because it's not imperative you follow a certain order. I'm going to remove the oil pump. Just a quick note on this oil pump though. You can see how it says GB5 on there. The reason I fitted this is because you can see I have been running a larger cylinder on this 50. It is a big bore, so I have the larger oil pump on here. That's just for those people who have noticed that. I also, though, normally these oil pump has screws, and these need to be impact wrenched off. Impact screwdriver off too, and but I don't like screws to begin with, so I usually, every time I have the opportunity, I replace the oil pump screws with bolts. So that's why these are bolts over here, but you will need to use your impact screwdriver to remove the bolts on or off of this oil pump. Quick sidetrack. I had a rather thin head bolt over here because I can't have the bolts stick farther out than these screws, and the reason I can't do that is because the clutch would actually collide with the head of the bolt. So if you do convert it, just make sure that your bolts don't stick out too far. I've made that mistake once. I've also replaced these with bolts once, and they were too big, so just a little heads up on that one. So I'm going to remove the bolts. Okay, now that you see that the bolts are removed, likely your oil pump is actually pretty stuck onto the cases. So the easiest way I find to remove it
is I simply take a whatever small thing, screwdriver, whatnot, and I just give it a whack, and I give it a whack so that it twists and it turns, just like that. See, and when I do that, now I know that it has cracked itself loose, and I can wiggle it. Well, that actually didn't even take any wiggling. I can just pull it off. This obviously, here's your gasket. I find these often you can just pull them off like this, and if they're not torn, you can reuse them. These are pretty durable paper gaskets. Of course, if you want, you can keep or you can replace it with a new one, but it's not necessary. I mean, you can see that this gasket is still completely intact. There are no tears, and there is no paper that has been stuck on the case either, so it's 100% acceptable to reuse this paper gasket. But like I said, completely up to you. It's not like they're expensive, and I think new gasket kits usually have the gasket kits usually come with a new one anyway. Okay, for the oil pump, this is just my personal opinion. I think I overthink things too much oftentimes. If you're not thinking that if you're not going to disassemble the oil pump and measure the gears inside to see how much it is pumping, then what I do is I wrap it up. I grab myself some paper towels, and I like to wrap it up, completely cover the oil pump so that there is nothing exposed to the air, the dirt, or whatnot. Mostly this is just to keep it clean, because now it's obviously you can see the channels are exposed, and so I wrap it up and then I put it over here with the other part. Okay, the last thing regarding the oil pump side, this engine does not have it, but if you have a C90, or if you're watching this and you have a C100, Astrea, EX5, I can't think of the other one, Super Cub 100, there you go. You can take out the collar in here. That is very, very easy to miss. There's a collar that's in here which has to take up the slack of the oil pump drive, but you can see this oil pump drive is fat because this is the short throw crankshaft, so you don't need the skinny oil pump drive shaft. But if there's a collar in here, I recommend taking that out now and putting it with your oil pump, because it's very easy to forget. Once you start pulling the cases off, you can drop it and not notice. So I think it's a good idea to pull it out now. But as I said, this engine does not have it, but the collar will be in here. Okay, next what we are going to do is we are going to be pulling off the parts related to the gear shifter. And so that's going to be this, and this. I'm not going to touch the gear star right now. What I'm just going to do is remove this arm. And all you need, and by the way, there are many different styles. This is where I have seen hex head screws in here. Usually ones that do not have a needle roller bearing. When I say needle roller, I mean that this side of the transmission uses needle roller bearings. If you don't know what those are, internet search that. And so they will use this sort of flat type of bolt. It's a very, very skinny head, but they will use this type of bolt. But I find that roller ball bearings typically have a Allen head, hex head, a screw holding this down. Just miscellaneous information for you. So we are going to take that off. Okay, we have removed that. There are 3 total parts. There's going to be a spring. This bolt, you notice how it has that collar so that this arm can rotate on it. Don't lose that bolt. It's a very specific bolt, okay? So if you have the one with the Allen head, it usually doesn't separate from the arm, so if you can't get it apart, don't worry about that. Let's grab ourselves another tin, shall we? Start putting those there. Oh, and by the way, keep regrouping. I'm going to put my circlip of the drive gear into here also. Like I said, it's just you don't have to do it that way. It's just a way of organizing yourself. Okay, next what you're going to do is you're going to need 2 10mm sockets, and the reason being is this. So if you are trying to simply take off this 10mm bolt, you'll notice that you start actuating the shift forks. Okay, but once it gets stuck, you see how it's getting stuck like that? Well, what's happening actually is the shift forks are trying to shift the gearbox. They're trying to shift the transmission into a different gear, but the cogs are not lined up. So if you understand what I'm saying, if you don't, sorry, but long story short is what you are doing is if once you feel it lock and then you torque the bolt loose, you give it a good amount of torque to get it loose, what you're actually doing is you're exerting torque on the shift forks, trying to shift the transmission, and you can bend the forks doing that. And so if you bend the forks, then good luck in having a bike that actually works correctly again. So what you need to do in order to avoid this situation is, and you're going to take one of your wrenches and you're going to hold it here, and then you're going to take the other wrench, and instead of turning the star, you can, because this is where your shift drum is, using this wrench is going to lock this in place. And when you lock that in place, then you can completely torque on one of these bolts. So what we're going to do is we're going to undo one of these bolts now. Okay, now this bolt has come loose, as you can see, as we have torqued it, and the star has not moved at all. But I want to, what if, now you're going to say only one bolt is going to come loose, right? And it's going to be the loosest bolt. So what if it's this side that comes loose instead of that side? What do? Don't worry, it's not the end of the world, because what you can do is, as long as we separate the gears, the kickstarter and such, you can actually pull off this case with all the with this and the gear shifter drum intact completely, and you can still separate the cases. So don't think it's the end of the world if you can't loosen it. The main thing is don't put torque on these shift forks. That is a very bad thing, obviously. So but this one came out, and so I'm going to undo it. Okay, and so here's our baking tin. You're going to see 6 pins, and these come out quite easily. So I like to remove these and put them in the baking tin also. Another thing to note, if you have a 4-speed cub, these you will have 5 pins, but one of them is going to be shorter than the others. Sometimes I don't have any fingernails, so I can't get these out. But yeah, just put the pins, make sure that if you want, use a magnet to get them out. Next, what we do is we're going to pull the gear shifter out. Now, you can just pull it out if you'd like, but what I actually like to do is I scrub. You're going to see the splines on the other side. These are clean, obviously, because I've already done this, but I scrub this side clean, and I scrub all the way down the shaft clean too. And why you do that is because dirt, mud and whatever can accumulate on there, and when you pull the gear shaft loose, you can actually dislodge a bunch of junk inside the engine. Now, of course, if you're going to split the cases anyway, I guess no harm done. But if you just happen to be replacing one side, say this thing is, say this arm is loose or something, or maybe your gear shaft is bent, that is something that you want to be aware of, is you can deposit a nasty amount of junk inside of your engine. Okay, and what you're going to do is pull out. Remember, you are fighting the seal too, the gear shaft seal, so it's not going to be a super smooth slide out. You're going to need to do some wiggling, but there's no trick to this. If the gear shaft seems to be stuck, however, this one is not. It's just going to take wiggling. As you can see, it's coming out. But if it's stuck, and you have to exert a lot of force just to seem to get it to move, you might have actually bent the shaft. And the only real way, if the shaft is really badly bent, the only real way to really free it is to cut the tail end of the shaft off. Because if you try and hammer it through, you actually can fracture the cases. Don't ask me how I know that. and you can also do damage to the housing which the gear shaft sits. So just a side note on that, that is my personal experience with that, but you can see this one's nice, true and straight. It slid all the way through. It's a big piece, so I'm just going to put it off to the side. And now the last thing we need to do to this side is to remove the snap ring on here. Has these two tabs, and we are going to pull off the spring and this little retainer bit right here. So I'm going to do that now. So take your snap ring pliers, remove the snap ring, and I'll show you how to remove the stop. By the way, as we continue on through the guide, if you want to remove the top end first, it's completely up to you. As I said, this is no particular order. I'm just doing this as I see fit. But you might notice though, especially if you have a C90 or if you have a cast iron barrel machine, your engine's probably going to start to fall over because it's a bit heavier on that side now. So if you're wondering, there's no particular reason why I put the engine this way. It just it's heavy and it likes to fall over like that. So okay, hey, actually this works great. So I can show you how to undo the spring. So yes, I'm using a metal implement, but I'm not scratching any of the gasket surfaces. I'm not actually contacting. If you're afraid of that, you can put a little bit of cloth right here, but I'm using kind of the dull end, so don't worry. I've done this before. I haven't damaged anything. But you're going to wedge your screwdriver under here, and you're going to pry up. You see how we're prying up the spring, and it's going to pop off, just like that. And there you go. You can remove the stop and the spring. It should slide off just like that. And now you are literally done with this side. There's nothing else to do, and you don't need to remove this at all. Of course, if there's damage to it, you can, but that's extremely rare. I've never seen that, to be honest. And so I'm going to put the stop in here, and I'm going to put the tin over here. So yeah, see how nicely that keeps everything organized. That's why I like to do that.